where we look at some great ways to create animations. I want to start with a quick reference to a previous module. As mentioned in Module 3, the brute force QMC method of calculating GI is often painfully slow when used with high quality settings. And when applied to animations, its lack of speed is even more apparent. For this reason alone, I don't recommend using this solution for animations unless you have little need for speed and efficiency. Preparing a QMC animation does not require the same level of care and attention that an irradiance or light cache solution requires, which, as we'll see, requires a precise set of steps. However, this is usually a minor consolation. In this module, I'll cover the precise sequence of steps needed to prepare an animation using the irradiance map and light cache, solutions which are both adaptive and reusable. Using these two solution types, I'll also cover when and how to cheat the system and move objects in your scene besides just the camera. Before we get into the methodology of creating an animation with GI, let's cover some basic principles and some basic V-Ray features that need to be thoroughly understood first. If you want to follow along, open the file entitled animation01.max. Let's start by looking at this simple scene consisting of a red sphere and an object representing floors and walls. When I render the scene, there's an obvious reflection of red from the ball onto the plane. Now, when I go to the indirect illumination rollout, you can see that I'm using an irradiance map for the primary bounce and a light cache for the secondary. The information used to calculate the bounced red light, as well as all of the illumination in this scene, is now stored in RAM as an irradiance map and a light cache. At the bottom of the irradiance map and light cache rollouts, there are controls that allow me to save the information calculated during the last rendered frame, which can be used to hasten and shorten the calculation of GI in other frames. And I want to do this now, so in the irradiance map rollout, I'll click the Save button, give the irradiance map a name, and save it to my hard drive. Now I want to tell V-Ray to reuse the save map so it doesn't have to be recalculated again when I render the same image again. So in the mode drop-down list, I'll select From File, and I'll click the Browse button, and I'll find the irradiance map I just saved. And I can repeat the exact same process for the light cache. I'll click the Save to File button, give the light cache a name, click the Browse button, and find the file I just saved. Now when I render, you can see that neither a light cache nor an irradiance map is being calculated again. Instead, they are being quickly loaded from the saved files. So when you hear the term baked light, this is what is meant. A GI solution is calculated and baked into the scene in the form of a 3D point cloud. A 3D point cloud is a collection of points in 3D space, which, in the case of the irradiance map and light cache, contains stored illumination values. So, in a sense, each of these points is like a light source that illuminates the surrounding surfaces. Since these illumination values are baked into the scene when you save a map during the rendering process, moving objects invalidates the total GI solution. If you ever have used the radiosity feature in Max, you'll know that anytime you change just about anything in your scene, you actually see a message telling you that the radiosity solution is invalid. And let's see this with V-Ray. So I'm using a saved irradiance map and light cache when I render. Now I'm going to move the sphere away from its current location, and I'm going to render the scene again. When I do, you can see the GI signature that the object left behind. This is the primary reason that a saved irradiance map and light cache can't be used in conjunction with moving objects, because moving objects can cause noticeable effects like this that would make an animation not so believable. But why can't we just use an irradiance map and light cache in an animation if we calculate a new and complete irradiance map and light cache for each frame? If we can do so for the QMC solution, why can't it be done for the other two solutions? Well, the reason is because, unlike the QMC method, which takes samples and calculates GI at every point independently from other samples and other points, the irradiance map and light cache are adaptive, and they take shortcuts by using surrounding samples to calculate GI at each point. When they do this for one frame along an animation path, the resulting GI calculation will almost certainly be different for each successive frame, meaning the pixel color for one specific point on the surface of an object will almost certainly be different than a pixel representing the exact same point in another frame. The difference will be extremely small in most cases, but large enough to notice flickering in the illumination. Let's look at an example. This image is a single image from an animation entitled Animation Sample 02, which is available in the support files. I'm scrolling through a sequence of about 15 images, and you can see a clear flickering in the GI. In some areas it's not too bad, but in other areas it's very bad, and one of the areas is this area around the window frame. If you play this animation, the effect becomes even more apparent, and it's really distracting. You simply can't have this kind of effect in animation. So all that's happening here is that in one frame, V-Ray approximates the GI, and in the very next frame, from a slightly different vantage point, the sample rays hit the same surfaces at different angles, and the long and complicated algorithms just yield different results. Very similar results, but again, any difference at all is noticeable. So when a new and complete irradiance map and light cache are calculated at each frame, the results are usually bad. For the QMC solution, the GI does not flicker because GI is calculated without borrowing information, and the QMC can calculate a near perfect solution. In fact, even when quality is not set very high, you still won't see flickering in the GI. What you'll see instead is flickering noise or grain, which is completely different. Instead of calculating a very small change in illumination, as with the irradiance map and light cache, QMC would instead only leave tiny holes in the calculation of the GI. The result is just as distracting. However, this is very fixable by improving the quality of the solution. No matter how much you try to improve the quality of the irradiance map and the light cache, when you calculate a new solution at each frame, the GI will almost always vary enough to be noticeable. So does this mean that the irradiance map and light cache shouldn't be used for an animation? Absolutely not. It just means that they should be used in a different way. Let's see exactly how using the irradiance map and the light cache properly is far quicker and more efficient than using the QMC method. Let's first look at the irradiance map. Within the mode drop-down list at the bottom of the irradiance map rollout, there are options which width to calculate an irradiance map. The first, single frame, is the default mode and the only one we've used prior to this module. It simply calculates a completely new irradiance map every time a rendering is conducted. The method we want to use when creating an irradiance map for an animation is the incremental add to current map method. What this mode does is cause V-Ray to create a completely new irradiance map during the first frame and add small amounts of information where needed during successive frames. As we saw from Module 1, an irradiance map is only available for primary bounces, which are those bounces that are visible within the camera's view. So during the first frame, we have an object block in the camera's view of part of the scene. The irradiance map won't be calculated, the GI, the irradiance map won't be calculated for this obscured area. But if the camera's view changes so that the same area is visible in a later frame, the irradiance map will add samples to this new area and add information derived by those samples to the irradiance map stored in the RAM. Unlike the single frame mode, which deletes the irradiance map that you just calculated, the incremental add to current map option saves the initial complete first frame and incrementally adds information to it as it's calculated. Now, there's two very good reasons for using this mode to create an irradiance map for an animation. First, it's very quick and efficient because instead of calculating a full map at each frame, V-Ray only needs to calculate every nth frame, which the exact number is based on how the camera moves in a scene, which we'll look at in just a little bit. The second reason is that it eliminates the potential for flickering illumination. Just like the flickering of pixels caused by image sampling and anti-aliasing, GI at any point or at any pixel that changes dramatically from one frame to the next can cause flickering. But when you create an animation with, when you create an irradiance map with incremental add to current map mode, there's no chance for flickering of GI because even though different samples are taken at different frames and even though the process is adaptive, the sample information for all evaluated frames is processed after all frames are accounted for and a uniform GI solution is used on each frame during the rendering process. The result is that the GI solution applied changes very little from one frame to the next, and there's no chance for flickering. So how often should you incrementally add to this current map? i.e., what should you set the nth value to? Well, that depends on a few things. It depends equally on the level of detail you want to bring out in your renderings, and also depends on the way your camera moves through your scene. As we saw in Module 1, when V-Ray doesn't take enough samples, detail can be lost. But just as important is how the camera moves around in your scene. If, for example, you add samples to the overall irradiance map at every 100th frame and your camera barely moves during the course of your animation, you'll most likely take an adequate number of samples. If, however, you add samples every 100th frames and your camera moves very fast or turns quickly, then you'll likely have far too few samples and you'll have a poor irradiance map. With time, you'll be able to gauge almost precisely what nth value works best for a particular camera path, but in the meantime, the easiest way to determine the adequacy of a particular nth value is to render a few frames in the animation. And specifically, if you render the first frame when you take a completely new irradiance map and when your irradiance map has the highest level of quality, and if you then compare the quality to other frames throughout your scene, you can easily determine whether or not the nth frame value needs adjustment. Now, the irradiance map is completely view dependent, meaning it only takes samples for surfaces directly visible by the camera during the frame where samples are being taken. For example, in our current scene where we're looking at a sphere lying in the center of a room, with the camera moving around it in a circular fashion, samples are taken at any given frame for just these areas where the camera can see. If I turn on the Show Samples option and render again, there are the samples. Now, if I save this map to File, switch to the From File option, and load the file I just saved, and render again, you can see from a different vantage point that the only samples that were taken before were those samples that were in view during the previous frame. Those areas that were in view during the previous frame. And so now, while using the saved irradiance map, if I render without the Show Samples option, you can see that I have an inadequate irradiance map because the GI in this particular view is completely awry. So instead of using the From File option at this point, I'll instead use the Incremental Add to Current Map option and render again at this frame. So now I know I have an adequate number of samples taken for frame 0 and frame 100. Now I'd ask, can I render frame 101 using the irradiance map I've just calculated? Well, in the course of one frame, the view changes so little you could probably get away with it because the only area in view that didn't have samples in the previous frame, didn't have samples taken in that previous frame, is this area along the edge. Does that mean that I should have to calculate more samples at this particular frame? Absolutely not. And the reason why is because if I simply take samples at a few spaced intervals, I can completely account for all the surfaces in view throughout the course of the entire animation. In the case of this particular scene of 200 frames, if I take samples at every 25th frame of my animation, I can probably have an adequate irradiance map throughout the entire animation because I can see all the areas in those 25 frames that I would see throughout the entire animation. So to generate an irradiance map for this particular scene, I'd use an nth value of 25 when I render the active time segment. And I can adjust once I figure out what kind of quality that every nth value of every 25th frame gives me. I can adjust up or down as I need to. Now, if my camera only moved a quarter away around the path in the same amount of time, i.e. if it moved at a quarter of the previous speed, it would make sense to still render every 25th frame because the view is not changing enough every 25 frames to warrant more samples. So in this case, I would incrementally add to the current map every 100th frame. Now, an important note about rendering the irradiance map is when I create the map, I shouldn't be wasting time rendering the final image. Now, obviously, when you're conducting test renders to determine what settings you need to use, you need to render the final image. But in this case, once I've determined those settings, I can enable the Don't Render Final Image option. And now when I render, I'm not wasting time rendering the final image. And one final note about the irradiance map when you render an animation. I always recommend using this option here, which tells V-Ray to automatically save the irradiance map after all the frames are complete. The irradiance map can take several hours to calculate for a complex scene, and if you come back to your computer and accidentally forget to save the file before you render another frame, the irradiance map, which was previously just sitting in RAM or in a temporary file on your hard drive, is permanently lost. You may also experience a computer crash or a power outage at some point between the time V-Ray completes the irradiance map and the time you return to your computer, in which case the irradiance map is once again lost. It just doesn't make sense not to use it. Okay, let's take a look at a couple animations and see what some appropriate nth values might be. Now, on this particular program I'm using for screen captures, I can't play animations, so I'm loading an animation up in RAM Player and playing it back through RAM Player. But even so, I'm only able to show, I believe, every 10th frame, so it's going to look quite choppy. In this animation, which you can download and view for better viewing, it's called Animation Sample 01, you can see that the camera's view changes very little throughout the course of the animation path. In this case, using an nth frame value of 100 would not be unreasonable. However, if I change to this animation entitled Animation Sample 02, you can see that the camera moves quite quickly along the path, and every 100th frames probably wouldn't suffice. Here I'd probably try every 25th frame and see what kind of quality it produces. If it doesn't produce good enough quality, I could drop it down to every 15th frame or even every 10th frame. But I always prefer to start with lower quality settings and work up as I need to. Okay, now let's take a close look at the light cache and how we use it to create animations. As we discussed during Module 2, the light cache is actually calculated prior to the irradiance map when the light cache is used as the secondary bounce engine. When this configuration is used, this configuration being the irradiance map and the light cache, when this configuration is used, the information calculated by the light cache is actually used to improve the calculation of the irradiance map, and it also speeds it up. So for this reason, when creating the animation, you should create a complete light cache prior to creating the irradiance map. But what is a complete light cache? Well, if we look at the 4 different options or 4 different modes we have available with the light cache, we can see that there's really only one mode, one option suitable for animation. Single frame mode is what we've been using up to this point. The from file mode is what we would use once we create a light cache and want to reuse it. And the progressive path tracing is a way of progressively adding light cache samples and letting your rendering run until the image appears adequate. The fly-through mode is really the only one that we can use for animations. What this mode does is it shoots and spreads out samples throughout the entire length of the animation. So if I have a camera that sits still and I calculate a light cache, you can see that the light cache appears no different than it ever has. It simply shows a type of preview of the final image. But if I switch to a different camera that starts in the same place and moves around in my scene, when I calculate the light cache now, you'll soon notice that my samples indicate a kind of blurring together, and you can actually see the traces of movement along the camera path. Now, it's really inconsequential which frame I'm at when I render, because when in fly-through mode, samples are taken everywhere along the path. I also want to make sure that I have a good subdivision value set, because remember from Module 2 that since the light cache samples are being taken throughout the entire animation, they have to be divided up, so the longer the animation, the greater this value needs to be. The less my view changes, i.e. the slower my camera moves, the less this value needs to be. I really can't put a set range of values on this particular parameter, such as a high and low value, because this value can change so dramatically from one animation to another. A value of several thousand is quite common for longer sequences. Now, as we saw in Module 2, there's 2 different scale modes with which to calculate a light cache, screen and screen and world. Screen is best used for stills, and the only time you would need to use world is during an animation, which we're looking at right now. The world option is commonly needed for animations because, as we saw, the samples are the same size throughout, and if you move through your scene fairly well, this option becomes more necessary. If your camera doesn't stray that far from its starting point, then you'll probably be best off leaving this option on screen. But if you move in and around your scene, you'll not only need to switch to world, you'll have to also determine the sample size that you need to set, which will almost always need adjustment. And experimentation is really the best way to determine the final sample size you need. If you want to look more into this, you can refer back to the Lightcast discussion in Module 2. There's another important setting to consider within the Lightcache rollout, and that's the Use Lightcache for Glossy Arrays option. This option can significantly reduce rendering times by using the approximation power of the Lightcache to help compute the computationally heavy glossy effects. If I don't use the Use Lightcache for Glossy Arrays option, then I will want to switch the secondary bounces to none. This saves RAM by not having to load the Lightcache, which is already stored in my Radiance map. If I do have the Use Lightcache for Glossy Arrays option enabled, then I certainly want to leave the Lightcache set as the secondary bounces. Otherwise, it won't be able to use the Lightcache to help compute the glossy arrays. But realistically, for small scenes where my Lightcache is quite small in size, such as when the file size is under 20 megabytes, which is quite common, loading an additional file of this size into RAM isn't going to make or break my ability to render with the RAM that I have available. At the very beginning of this module, I mentioned that the QMC method of calculating GI is painfully slow for animations when high quality settings are used. But a really nice benefit of using this method is the fact that you don't have numerous steps to complete before your final animation is prepared. If you have a decent render farm, or if you use a third-party render farm, this could be a nice benefit. Say for example you have a fairly large animation to render over a weekend. Well, if the Lightcache takes an hour to calculate, the Radiance map 2 hours to calculate, and the actual rendering takes 50 hours to calculate, when 5 p.m. on Friday rolls around, you better have already calculated your 2 GI solutions by then, or you probably won't be making your dinner date. With the QMC method, you don't have to worry about this because there's no need to calculate or to pre-calculate a GI solution, and therefore you have no added steps. You simply click the render button and off you go. Besides the extreme aggravation of missing one of these steps when you calculate a Lightcache or an Radiance map, such as not switching to the fly-through mode or switching to incrementally add the current map, using the Lightcache or a Radiance map can be tricky when you render with a third-party render farm. For example, at 3ds, we use a third-party render farm for most of our large projects. However, for the one that we use, it took a good deal of time learning all the nuances that this particular render farm displayed. For example, none of the cache files being like a Lightcache or a Radiance map or a V-Ray proxy, none of these cache files could have unusual characters in the file name such as an apostrophe. If they do, your entire animation is doomed, and you might not even find out until several hours after the rendering process starts. These characteristics, while they're aggravating at first, can be learned over time, and you're still apt to miss a step or two in the process once in a while when you use a Lightcache and a Radiance map, and one step will almost certainly result in a failed animation, but this is something that can be worked out over time, and you can figure out how to use these third-party rendering farms pretty easy. At the very least, I highly recommend using a checklist when you use a Radiance map or a Lightcache, especially when you use a third-party render farm. With the QMC method, you really don't have to worry about any of these steps. There are no extra steps, and this makes using the QMC method more appealing for some people. Okay, well, up to this point, we've primarily focused on the basic principles of how to use the Radiance map and Lightcache for animations, but we really haven't looked at the actual steps needed to create an animation. And as I mentioned, you really need to use a checklist because, as far as I'm concerned, just like pilots that get ready to take off in an airplane, no matter how many times you create these animations, it's only a matter of time before you miss a step and it ends up costing a significant amount of time and money. So let's look at exactly what the steps are when using the Radiance map and Lightcache. And at the end of the module, the last thing we'll look at is this checklist, which is also available with the support files, and it's entitled animationchecklist.pdf. First of all, as mentioned, you should really calculate the Lightcache first, so the first thing I want to do is set my primary and secondary bounces to Lightcache. Now I'll go to the global switches rollout and enable the don't render final image option. And again, this is so that I don't waste time calculating the final image. While the light cache is being calculated, I want to enable the show calc phase so that I can see from the start a sort of preview of the animation, so I know at least that I'm not rendering the wrong viewport or that I haven't neglected a major light setting of some sort. Next, I need to switch to the fly-through mode so that light cache samples are taken throughout my entire animation, not just the current frame. And again, it doesn't matter what frame I'm currently rendering at or currently at when I render, because it's going to be the same either way, regardless of what frame I'm at. I also want to make sure that I have a good subdivision value set, so I want to check this value now. For this animation, I'm going to leave the subdivision value at 500, but this could get much, much higher for longer animations. Before I start the rendering, I'm going to make sure that I also have the autosave option enabled, and I give the light cache a file name and a save location. Also, I obviously don't need to worry about saving the final image, especially since I'm not even creating the final image. Now I can set the rendering in motion, and once completed, I have the light cache saved to file. Now I'll load the saved light cache file by switching to From File, clicking Browse, and locating the light cache that I just saved. So my light cache is now loaded. Next, I want to calculate the irradiance map. I'll go to the indirect illumination rollout and switch the primary bounce type to irradiance map. Within the irradiance map rollout, I want to make sure that the show calc phase option is on, and for the irradiance map I need to switch from single mode to incremental add to current map. Again, just like with the light cache, I always want to make sure that I use the autosave option. So I'll click Browse, I'll give a file name and a save location, and now I don't have to worry about losing the irradiance map once it's finished calculating. In the global switches rollout, I want to leave the don't render final image option enabled, and now I need to decide in the comment tab of the render scene dialog box what my nth frame value is going to be at. First, I need to switch to the active time segment, and here I'm going to use a value of every 50th frame, which I decide by considering the detail I need and, most importantly, how fast my view changes. With these parameters set, I can start my rendering, or at least my irradiance map rendering, and when finished, I have the irradiance map stored in file, which now I want to load using the From File mode in the irradiance map rollout. I also want to check to see if I'm using the light cache for glossy rays option, and if not, then I'll want to switch the secondary bounces to none. And again, this saves RAM by not having to load the light cache, which is already stored in my irradiance map. If I do have the use light cache for glossy rays option enabled, then I will need to leave the light cache as the secondary bounces. Okay, since my irradiance map and light cache are now set, I can turn off the don't render final image option and go back to the comment tab and return my nth frame option to 1. Finally, I need to tell Max to save the final image to a file. So I'll give the sequence of images a name and a location, and I should be all set now to render. Alright, well, since this is a discussion on animations, I think it would be appropriate to mention again the importance of using the right anti-aliasing filter when you render animations. Aliasing, remember, is a term that describes the imperfections in renderings, and it's caused primarily when drastic color changes occur over too small an area of screen space to be adequately depicted by the pixels that define that space. Just as we saw with image sampling in Module 1, aliasing occurs because the computer or TV display does not properly handle the case in which a pixel is only partially covered. Partially covered pixels occur along the edges of objects, and they're referred to as edge pixels or fragment pixels. The mishandling of these fragment pixels results in harsh, sometimes jagged color transitions between the object's edge and the background. And in a still image, anti-aliasing can certainly be noticeable and reduce the realism, but if you put the same scene in motion, the results are usually distracting, really distracting, and they can really ruin what would otherwise be a great animation. Two examples are flickering and texture crawling. But remember that my use of the term flickering earlier in this module is different from my use of it now with anti-aliasing. Although the same concept applies, the cause and effect are slightly different. With anti-aliasing, it's caused by the reasons I just mentioned, but in GI, it's caused by not baking light. So pick your anti-aliasing filter wisely. When you use a filter such as Catmull ROM or Mitchell-Netravalle, these work great for stills, but they're sure to maximize the effects of flickering and texture crawling. When you create animations, you really need to use other filters that blur the final rendered output, which minimizes these anti-aliasing side effects. Two filters that work well for animations are the area filter and video filter. Remember, however, that the more blurred a filter, the greater the rendering time. That's pretty much the same with any effect in Max. At 3ds, we use the area filter to create animations whenever possible, because using the video filter can easily add 25% to your final render times, and also because it's more blurred, which is really not a desirable effect. However, the area filter usually causes too much flickering and texture crawling, so we either need to use the video filter or we need to render at a higher output. And as I mentioned before in Module 1, this is a great way to get the sharpness without having to worry about anti-aliasing side effects, at least not as much. And this that I'm talking about is rendering at a higher resolution and converting down to a small size. The results of doing this can be amazing. Here's two images. The first image is rendered at standard size. I think it was 720 by 480. And you can see a slightly blurred image. This is using the area filter. And this next image is the exact same scene. Nothing has changed. The only difference is it was rendered in high def and converted down to the same size. And you see it's much sharper. And when this animation is put into motion, and you can download this animation from the support files, both of these animations, but when you put the animation that was rendered in high definition into motion, you don't see these anti-aliasing side effects, at least not as much as when you rendered at standard definition. So the results really can be amazing. And from what I hear, movie studios use the same process when they render animations like Shrek. They'll render even well above high definition standards so that when they play back at standard size, the animations are nearly flawless in terms of these anti-aliasing side effects. One more thing I want to point out with animations before ending this discussion is the great many advantages of using post-production software such as After Effects. By rendering your output to the RPF file type, you can dramatically increase speed and efficiency in animations when you do certain things. For example, if you create an animation where a light increases or decreases in illumination, you can render one frame and use a separate rendering pass to isolate the effects of the light and quickly render the animation in After Effects with just one rendering having been created with 3ds Max. Otherwise, you'll have to render each individual frame of your animation in 3ds Max, which would take much longer. So it might be worthwhile to look into this type of software for your animation needs. Well, that's everything I wanted to cover for this module on animation. Let's review what's been covered so far. First of all, flickering GI is a significant problem in animations, and it's caused primarily by calculating a new irradiance map and a new light cache for each individual frame. Calculating a completely new light cache or irradiance map not only produces poor results, it takes much longer. So instead, use the incremental add to current map and the fly-through modes. And this is what is known as baked light. When you calculate an irradiance map, remember that the slower that your camera moves and the slower that your view changes, the less often that you need to incrementally add samples to the current map. So increasing the every nth frame value will reduce the number of frames for which you need to add samples, and this will therefore reduce your rendering times. When you have large animations to create, consider using a third-party rendering farm. But whether you use a third-party rendering farm or render out animations completely in-house, you should always use a checklist to prevent missing a critical step that would certainly lead to failure in the rendering process. And here's a checklist that I use to create animations, and you can view this checklist. It's entitled Animation Checklist. It's a PDF file, and it's found in the support files of these modules. And this concludes Module 4, Animations.